But we begin with new reporting from the Washington Post on the high-stakes investigation of this Trump organization in New York. Tonight is also the eve of the New York primary for DA. A reminder that the current DA, Cy Vance, leaves office in just 7 months, which sets that time period as the likely deadline for any decisions on charging alleged criminal conduct at the Trump organization, where Chief Financial Officer Alan Weisselberg has been seen dutifully going into work at Trump Tower, with the Washington Post reporting on how the money man is balancing the appearance of those normal job duties against huge pressure from prosecutors for evidence implicating Trump, with reports that he continues to resist cooperating. One DA veteran likening his approach to playing Russian roulette with prison time, a serious game for a 74-year-old. The Post reporting reinforces the picture from a recent New York Times account on the road to charges for Weisselberg as soon as this summer, and also reinforces the stakes at play. Also new today, the Wall Street Journal reporting prosecutors investigating whether Trump's former bodyguard, Matthew Calamari, who was also a Trump executive, received his own tax-free fringe benefits, and whether that is a scandal or worse, a crime. Now, there is plenty of bad news in all these developments for Trump. But if Weisselberg stands tall against the DA, it could give Donald Trump the out he needs. That same Post article reports that without Weisselberg's cooperation, it's unclear whether prosecutors would be able to establish any required intent on Trump's part for crimes. So, yes, there is heat on Weisselberg, a lot of it. But there's also heat on the prosecutors because Trump kept such a small financial circle, which means very few people can speak to his decisions. And that same Washington Post article includes a point that we first reported last week here on The Beat, and then in an interview with a veteran of the DA office doing this probe, Dan Alonzo, who told us about this other legal road where, as the Post puts it in their news story, the DA has the option to indict companies rather than individuals. Now, that would split the proverbial legal baby if Weisselberg gives up nothing, but if there is enough evidence for prosecutors to indict him and the company as sort of a first step by December, to then see what the players would do then. Joining us right now is NYU law professor Melissa Murray and former RNC chair Michael Steele. Professor, your view of the combined picture we're getting from each of these reports about the probe.
Well, it's definitely a case of keep your friends close and your enemies, or at least those who can testify against you, closer. And so it seems that former President Trump is keeping tabs on Mr. Weisselberg because Mr. Weisselberg is one member of that very small circle of trust. And it's not just that the fact that the circle of trust is small that makes it difficult for the prosecutors. It's also that former President Trump has, over his course of business, been really reticent to document his doings in email. He famously doesn't use email. He doesn't write things down. So it's really Mr. Weisselberg who has been sort of the eyes and ears of this whole operation that can provide the information to link any misdoings to Trump. And that's really what's needed here. So if Weisselberg isn't talking, it's going to be very difficult to actually get the goods to prove intent on the part of Trump.
Yeah. And Michael, this Journal story, again, shows all the different ways that the probe is going forward, because we've had all these drips of news from the grand jury being impaneled to who's facing it to who has the heat. Matthew Calamari, some careful Apprentice viewers may recall, but they say prosecutors have this interest in him, once the bodyguard, indicating the probe into the Trump organization's alleged practice of providing employees with cars and apartments extends beyond Weisselberg, and also extends to whether this was, Michael, in the eyes of the DA, a kind of a modus operandi, that from beginning to end, they were always, according at least to this theory of the case, looking for ways to cheat the government, to lie to regulators, to kind of nip and tuck every which way. And alone, isolated, some of these things might get by. If you take it all together, the question is, does it get to a financial number where you have not only a case, but you have a jury going, oh, well, if it's tens of millions of dollars, why do they get to write that off if nobody else does?
Yeah, I agree with that that approach analysis, Ari. But here's the rub. I mean, look, the reality of it is, and I think this is what a lot of this investigation is exposing, that this is a corrupt enterprise. I mean, it's just the way Trump did things, deliberately or not so deliberately. There are corrupt elements to it. The question still remains, what can be proven? And that's one. Two, how much of it rises to and sticks to Donald Trump? I'm still not convinced that with all of the hand wringing about Weisselberg and his daughter-in-law, is on, prosecutors are talking to her and she's out here, okay, laying out some tracks. I still don't know how much of this is really going to double back on him. Bodyguards, Weisselberg, Trump endears a level of loyalty that, absent of, someone like, his lawyer, it just seems to be one of those things that everyone just kind of sticks close to this guy. Michael Cohen is the only one who's really kind of gone out here and laid down a little bit of the inside on the inside, but others have not. I mean, even those who are sort of tangentially attached to Trump haven't turned state's evidence to the degree, whether you're talking about the Mueller probe, or I think now with with what's going on with Weisselberg. I still want to sit back and just sort of assess this. I'm skeptical that there's a lot there that Weisselberg and others are just going to just turn over. Look, cut the deal, take care of my family. I got your back. Don't worry about it. I mean, that's it's that scene from The Godfather where they go visit what's his name in the jail, and they sort of say, look, he asks, how's my brother doing? We'll take care of your brother. Don't worry about your brother. It's that kind of deal. So the family's going to be taken care of. Okay, maybe I don't turn state's evidence and I take one for Trump. I just don't. That's how people think in this world, and I just don't know how we can rely on something other than that.
Yeah. No, I think that's the skepticism that's relevant. And that brings us to the ways that even when caught, he's gotten out of things. Our panel stays, but I want to also mention some special reporting here on Weisselberg's past depositions. There was the criminal probe of Trump U. Weisselberg described his relationship with Trump as close but one-sided then. He said, I wouldn't go in there and just chit-chat, but if I had a reason to go in and discuss a business matter, we'd have a conversation. This is context for a very special guest we have to join our panel tonight, Tristan Snell, prosecutor who helped lead the investigation of Trump U. Thank you for joining us. Trump U famously was a business that gave out business advice that ultimately went out of business. So it wasn't a great smash success. But to Michael Steele's point, which you can pick up on, there is the view that even when caught, even to the tune of millions, the big guy tends to swim off. What are your insights on all of this from your experience there?
Well, we actually got a court decision in that case that he didn't swim off. We actually got a court decision in the intermediate level of that case before it settled, where it was decided that Trump and the Trump Organization were liable for Trump University's misdeeds. So he doesn't always swim off. It's just that no one's really come at him this hard that often. And as for Cohen being the only one to turn, well, he's the only one or one of the only ones who's actually been indicted in Trump's inner circle. When things are actually hitting you and you're actually really seeing the prospect of being convicted of a crime, people's tune can change. So I think we're way too early to say that he's going to turn or not turn. I think once he's indicted, we could see a very different situation arise. By whom
if
I
he's
mean
indicted,
Weisselberg.
although the Times says
if he's indicted,
Weisselberg, right? Although the Times says
if
that
he's indicted, if Weisselberg's indicted, we could see a very different story.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to let Michael respond to you because the orator that he is, I'm sure he has a rebuttal cooking. But I'll give you one more question before we bring him in, which is Weisselberg is someone that you dealt with in this manner. I'm reading here from Washington Post reporting. He oversaw the spending decisions at Trump U, the online program which drew those 3 lawsuits. The deposition in the case speaks to that. And so, there are experts here who say Money Man only scratches the surface. He was at times basically the acting CEO. What, if anything, can you tell us about that based on your knowledge? And is that good or bad for him as he faces this heat?
Well, first off, you can find out a lot about an organization, about a company, about a target without actually having them cooperate with you. So we were able to get a lot of information on how the Trump Organization worked and Weisselberg's role in it, despite the fact that we did not have Weisselberg's cooperation. We never even felt like we needed to bring him in as a witness because we had already had enough knowledge of everything that we didn't really need Weisselberg, but we were still able to find the Trump Organization liable. And a lot of why the judge in the Trump University case decided that Trump Organization was liable was because of Weisselberg's very heavy-handed day-to-day control of the organization. Very much he was the acting CEO. I would also say that he was basically the COO, the Chief Operating Officer of the Trump Organization, a role which has never really been filled, at least not that I know of in the past 20 years. So the CFO, you know, they're the ones actually like keeping the books and tracking the P&Ls and seeing exactly what money's in and which businesses would die. At one point, the Trump University was not making very much money at first. And it was Weisselberg who actually had the Trump University people come in and say, hey, this business better start making more money or I'm shutting it down. He gave them an ultimatum. That came from Weisselberg, not from Trump. We think of Trump being the guy who runs around telling people you're fired. In real life, a lot of times it was Weisselberg who was the enforcer. He was not just the bean counter. He had a lot of power within the organization to determine what businesses were going to do what, which ones would actually go forward, and which ones would be shut down.
Michael?
First off, I'm not going to clap back on the Assistant Attorney General. That's number one. So the brother, he's got the cred. I'm going to rely on that street cred on the point. But two, he actually just made the point I was probably not that well articulating. And that is, at the end of the day, Trump is in the game, but he's removed from the game. In other words, he's in the process, but he's removed from it.